thank you so much for having me and for sticking around. I know I was going to make that shit joke about being the person standing between you and the pub. And then I thought, who among us has any form of social battery anymore now since 2020? Seriously, hands up if you have any social battery left. I knew your bloody hand was going to go up. Dave Lattori is the only person in the world with social battery now. But yeah, for the rest of you, if this overruns, you're welcome. I'm like a modern day Jesus for introverts. So for those of you who don't know me, my name is Amy and I am a content design and design systems consultant based here in the UK. Now, following Scott's talk, I wanted to make a couple of important clarifications off the bat before we get going. So here are 4 things that I wasn't expecting to have to say at the start of this talk. Thanks, Scott, mate. I myself am not a Ketwig. I am merely an admirer of their work. If you are not familiar with Ketwigs and you don't know what any of this is about, I'm very happy to tell you more about it, but I'm not going to do that now. What I am going to do instead is I'm going to talk to you for the next 40 minutes or so about design systems. And I've worked kind of mostly on design systems now for the past 7 or 8 years. And in that time, I've worked on them for different organisations. So for gov.uk, for Babylon Health, for BT, which also includes EE and PlusNet, for research organisations, Springer Nature and the Wellcome Trust, for Camden Council, for Wayflyer, and now I'm working with a refurbished tech marketplace called Backmarket. But this is not what I've always done. So in a previous life, I actually worked as a researcher for a gardening magazine. Now, some of you might know this. Some of your parents probably read this. It's called Which Gardening, and it does lots of research and testing into plants and products to help people understand how to manage their gardens at home. And I actually made it into the magazine once. It's a career highlight of mine, in a hard-hitting piece about out-of-date compost on sale in garden centres. The scandal. So here I am, casually hanging out with a bag of the offending produce in my back garden. And if you look at my face real close there, you'll see the dawning realisation that I wasn't, in fact, cut out for a career in horticultural journalism. But the inspiration for this talk actually did come from that time of my life, from a relic that I found the other day. So when I was sorting through some old books recently, I came across this one, How Not to Kill Your Plants, by an author called Nick Southern. And I thought that a spin on this would actually make for a really good talk on design systems for a couple of reasons. So firstly, having worked with a few different people now on their design systems, I've had the privilege or maybe the misfortune of learning a lot about what causes design systems to fail. Please hire me. And secondly, I also think a lot of the mistakes that we make with design systems happen because of the way that we kind of conceive of them and the way we think about them. And to prove that, let me ask you a question. When you think about design systems, what is the first analogy that comes to mind? So what's the thing you most often hear us comparing them to when we're trying to explain them to people? Anyone shout out? Lego. Sorry if you said anything else. I thought everyone was going to say Lego. But Lego, correct. So when we talk about design systems as Lego, we're really sort of talking about them as these collections of kind of simplistic modular parts that can be assembled in different ways to create larger parts of our user interfaces. And on the surface, it's really easy to see how that makes sense, right? So Lego is predictable and it can be categorized by shape, color, and size, and it can be assembled in these proven and predictable ways, as well as novel and experimental ways, to really create an almost infinite variety of different outcomes. But there is an important limitation with this analogy. And that's that the only important thing about Lego is the Lego itself, not the environment that that Lego is being used in. And so when we talk about design systems as Lego, we're really only thinking about those kind of discrete, distinguishable, it's a word that's too late in the day for me to try and say, distinguishable constituent parts of the system. So like the components, the design patterns, the guidelines, the tools. And what we're not thinking about is the environment. And with design systems, at least 50% of our chance of success comes from the environment that we're working in. So that's things like the size, the culture, the practices, and the people in our organisation, which are at least as important, if not more, than the artefacts that comprise our design system. And what I've learned is that in order to be successful, there has to be harmony between those constituent parts and the environment that those parts are being created in. And so for this reason, and just to keep the theme of the talk, I prefer to think of design systems as being less like Lego and more like gardens. So skilled gardeners don't just take nice plants and put them in the ground in a pleasing layout. They take stock of the climate and the soil and the nature of the space and what it's being used for, and then they cultivate planting systems that work with and not against the landscape that they exist in. And it's this foundational concept that underpins the 3 principles that I'm going to share today for how not to kill your design system. So let's jump in with the first one. Design for existing systems and not against them. So to continue with the gardening theme here, I'm going to tell you about a problem that I encountered when I bought my first house a few years ago. So it was a little Victorian cottage in a quiet street on the town where I live. And one of the things that I loved the most about the house when I first saw it was this big old apple tree in the middle of the back garden. So the garden overall wasn't in great condition. It needed a lot of work doing to it. But the tree was really healthy and really beautiful. And so when I moved in, I got to work kind of weeding and clearing and eventually laid some new turf across the dying lawn. But after a few weeks, I noticed that the grass, the new grass, which was otherwise looking kind of green and quite healthy, was not really growing properly around the base of this tree. So the tree's roots were poking up through the soil and the ground around it was brown and bare. And after a bit of Googling the issue, I learned that trees like this often take nutrients out of the ground around them. So they soak up water and other minerals and vitamins from the soil, which makes it really difficult for grass to grow around the base. And so despite following all the guidance about how to lay new turf, this grass just wasn't going to grow around the base of this tree. So years later, last year in fact, I found myself working with a non-profit client who asked for my support in the final stages of getting their new design system ready to launch. Now, their current design and development practices were, to put it mildly, a bit of a mess. Departments and sometimes individual teams were relying on local UI kits to guide their design and prototyping work. And then similarly, developers in the organisations had started to establish component libraries to avoid repeating work, but these only really existed at the level of individual products or product areas. And the process of keeping these UI kits and corresponding component libraries in sync was running smoothly in some parts of the organisation, but was less clear and more difficult in others. And not surprisingly, these fragmented and inconsistent ways of working led to inconsistent digital products and a pretty disjointed experience for the organisation's service users. And so the team that hired me in spent several months designing a better solution. And it was a fairly typical design system which aimed to kind of replace these disparate local libraries with global components and guidelines and standards to follow. They'd worked really hard on the run up to way before I kind of joined to create a simpler system that would lead inevitably to more consistency across their different digital products and a better user experience. Or that's what we thought. But then several months after the launch, they found themselves with an unexpected problem. They had absolutely succeeded in designing a picture-perfect design system. It was well organised, it was well documented and robust and reliable, and on paper, there was absolutely no reason that it shouldn't have been a success. But despite their efforts, they had failed to convince anyone to actually use it, which is kind of a problem. Now, no one could have accused them of not giving the design system adequate consideration. So they had poured time and care and effort into understanding the problems with their current systems and their current kind of practices and tools. And they had designed new documentation, code and design libraries that were objectively better than what they already had. But what they didn't account for was people. The people in any organisation form the most important and simultaneously the most overlooked part of any design system. The way that those people work, the knowledge that they have and the practices and processes that they've established are kind of like the roots of that old apple tree in my garden. They might be disruptive, imperfect, gnarly, even unsightly. But they will not give up without a fight. Because the thing about humans is that old habits die hard. So even if those habits are inefficient or detrimental in some way, we are just hardwired to seek out the comfortable and the familiar over the new and improved. And our inability to account for this in any meaningful way is why so many new design systems fail. And so to be successful, we have to work with those human systems in our organisations, and we have to ask ourselves, what kind of mindsets and behaviours do the designers and developers that we're building this design system for need to have to be able to work with them? And so at this point, the team and I went back out into the organisation and we spent time really learning about our users and the human beings that this new system would impact and what their objections and fears were. So what was this resistance to using the new system? And through that, we learned that people had reservations. So they were wary of using the new design system, fearing that it might create work for them, or that it wouldn't meet their needs, or that it wasn't meant for them anyway, or that it was going to threaten their autonomy, or maybe even their job, if the organisation started to rely on centralised tooling and systems over contextual judgment. And these were not wrong, right? These were just barriers that we had to work through with them and reassurances that we needed to provide in order to make sure that the system we created actually got used. So adoption was slower than expected, but it did start to accelerate once we started to pay attention to these concerns. And what I want you to take away from this is that successful design systems go beyond just introducing new tools and guidelines and designing a better way of working on paper. They work with the organisation's existing systems, so its practices, culture and people, to create lasting change. So now I'm going to move on to talk about my second piece of advice for keeping your design system alive, which is to put context before convention. So let's return to horticulture for a minute, because I am nothing if not steadfastly committed to my tenuous metaphors. So for several years in the late 2010s, and to some extent even today, hydrangeas were a floral trend that wouldn't die. So not long into moving into the house with the garden with the great big apple tree, we took a trip down to Cornwall and went to visit this National Trust site, which had a famous hydrangea garden. And having at that point spent many months with my head in interiors magazines, looking at pictures of fresh and dried hydrangeas kind of artfully arranged in these lovely vintage vases, I decided to jump aboard this particular bandwagon and plant my own hydrangeas when I got home. However, much like the efforts to lay turf around the base of the apple tree, it did not go well. So as I despairingly watched the leaves of several shrubs turn yellow and eventually die with the rest of the plant, I took once again to Google to try and find out what was going on. And I was swiftly confronted with three inescapable facts. Now, number one, I didn't have to Google this one. I live in a county called Hertfordshire. Number two, Hertfordshire, unlike Cornwall, has famously chalky and acidic soil. And number three, and I think you've probably guessed where this is going, hydrangeas hate chalky soil. And so the unavoidable truth was that this particular trend was just not going to work for me and my garden. And so to bring this back to design systems, I'm going to tell you another story. In January in 2020, after about 3 years working on the WK design system team, I decided I was going to start working as an independent consultant. In hindsight, a bold decision, given that we had a pandemic coming, but I didn't know that at the time. But I was pretty lucky then. I got my first gig quite quickly with a healthcare company who had read about my work and wanted my help leading their new design system team. And I pretty much felt like I'd won the consultancy lottery on my first play when the client in question told me that they basically wanted me to do exactly what I had done before. So they were like, oh, you know that GovUK design system that you built over there at GDS? Could you just do that here? And in particular, the client was really interested in establishing a contribution practice like the one that we had written and talked about for the GovUK design system. So the GovUK design system had what I would consider to be a kind of quintessential design system contribution model. And for those of you who aren't familiar with quintessential design system contribution models, embarrassing for you, I will walk you through what that looks like. So somebody outside of the design system team decides to contribute. They then follow our immaculate contribution guidelines and criteria to develop that contribution to the appropriate standard with support from the design system team. The contribution then gets reviewed by a working group of designers and developers. And then it's either published or it goes back to the contributor for refinements and iterations before then being published. And Scott told us off about linear process diagrams earlier, so I'd like to point out not always running as smoothly as pictured here. But on the whole, it did run quite well, and it followed a pretty conventional approach to design systems contribution. So when my client asked me to set up the same contribution model for them, I couldn't believe my luck. I was like, easy. I already know how to do this. I knew what it looked like. And the great thing was I didn't even have to convince them that this was the right way to go about things because they were already bought into the idea. But, as we're about to see, my confidence was misplaced. And that's because the context that I was working in by then was drastically different from the one that I had just come from at GDS. So for starters, at the time that I left GDS, the team working on the WK design system had 11 people in it. But my new client team was just 4 of us. The GovUK brand and visual language was well established long before the GovUK design system was introduced as a means of making it easier and more efficient to apply. But with my new client, they were a fast-growing startup that was still figuring out their brand and its expression. And since GovUK is web only, we've been able to stick to a really simple tech stack. But my new client needed to support web, iOS, and Android, and all the complexity that comes with that. Also, the culture and the community and the conventions that underpinned the design and development practices at government were mature and solid. But with my new client, small, agile teams of designers and developers had found their own distinct ways of working in the absence of a kind of organisation-wide established set of standards. And unlike anywhere else that I've worked before or since, designers in government are encouraged to prototype in code, meaning that there's really tight collaboration between designers and developers in the organisation, and there's really good kind of cross-disciplinary understanding. But at my new client's organisation, designers and developers worked in silos with this real kind of handover mentality. So designers would hand prototypes over and the conversation pretty much ended there. And so the strong, entrenched design principles and culture of simplicity at GDS meant that it had been quite easy to come up with a set of standards and contribution criteria that everybody could agree on and work to. But for my new client, these fragmented processes and all the complexity made it much harder to get any kind of convergence. But despite all of this, I charged ahead and tried to recreate GovUK's contribution model. So we set about creating comprehensive contribution documentation explaining how you should contribute and the standards that we expected you to meet. We started educating our stakeholders and our users about the benefits of using a federated model to help scale the design system through contribution. And we basically said, come in, we're open for business, contribute. But But as it turns out, as a team of 4 people trying to build the foundations of a new and ambitious design system, we very quickly became overwhelmed with demand. So a huge difference between my client team here and the one that I just come from at GDS was its size and maturity. And at GDS, we just had a lot more capacity to support incoming contribution and to react to it in quite a kind of ad hoc way. And so very quickly, my new team and I had to take a complete and fairly embarrassing U-turn and go from we're open for business to sorry, we're closed. We can't take your contributions. And we had to shut it down completely. And that's because what I know now is that supporting contribution in an ad hoc way, whilst you are setting up a system's foundations, is like trying to fit windows into a house that you haven't built yet. And when I look back at this and I talk about it now, it seems really obvious to me that the task that we'd set ourselves was just completely unachievable from the outset. So we were never really going to be able to support contribution in that at that point in time in the way that we promised. But back then, I didn't know this, and so I didn't communicate that. And what ended up happening is we had completely overpromised, and people were getting seriously pissed off with us, right? They'd been promised this community-led collaborative design system, but now we were gatekeeping and refusing their contributions. We started to lose trust at an alarming rate, and we saw a spike in local component libraries being set up as people started to create their own spaces where they could contribute freely without this bottleneck that we were creating. And so clearly we had to respond and do something differently. And so we abandoned the GovUK Design Systems contribution model and its traditional approach of allowing contributors to bring things to us when they felt compelled to contribute, and we took a more proactive approach. So what we did instead is we published our roadmap of components that we knew we needed to deliver in an order that made sense for us to deliver them in. We set up a weekly forum for contributors to provide input into the components we were working on, with each week concentrating on a different component. And then we used these sessions to gather requirements and research insights and examples and feedback on our early designs. We then took the outcomes of that session and used them to guide the development of our new component before eventually publishing them. Now, this approach allowed us to start to establish this culture of collaboration and contribution without getting derailed by all these ad hoc submissions kind of coming at us. The sessions also started to strengthen relationships between the designers and developers in the organisation and to cross-pollinate knowledge between the disciplines, which was something that was really needed there. And so in the end, we took stock of our existing practices and processes that formed our organisation's systems for designing and developing its products. And we worked with that context to create something this time round that actually fit. And when I look back at that time, I can see that much like my ambition to grow hydrangeas, we were trying to follow a convention that was just completely incompatible with the conditions of our organisation at that point in time. And I think that as design system practitioners, it's understandable that we do want to look for tried and tested solutions. But the important thing is that we first take stock of our context and we look at kind of where we're operating. So now I'm going to talk to you about my last piece of wisdom, and then we can go to the pub, on how not to kill your design system, which is all about how we measure our success. So not by our outputs, but by the outcomes of what we're doing. So let's imagine for a moment that a design system is a vegetable patch, because why not? So although we might feel good about doing so, we probably wouldn't consider digging out our vegetable patch, like the act of kind of digging out the planting area, a success in and of itself. And we also probably wouldn't celebrate and say that we've done our job when we planted seedlings. And again, although we might feel proud of ourselves for our commitment to the task at hand, we probably wouldn't consider our vegetable patch to have been a success just because we'd remembered to water it as directed. All of these things are just a means to an end, right? So they're just tasks that we kind of complete en route to achieving our desired outcome, which is probably something like a basket of successfully harvested vegetables, or in actual fact, the satisfaction maybe of enjoying a plate of homegrown produce, which looks very lurid on that screen. But yeah, if you work in tech, UX, or product design or engineering, which I guess most of you in this room probably do, this idea won't be new to you. So we talk a lot about the importance of outcomes and impact over outputs and features in this space in general. But when it comes to design systems in particular, I think we often get so involved in the work that we often lose sight of this. And we start to look at our objectives as kind of tasks on a checklist. So this is actually a product somebody's created, which is like the design systems checklist. And we start to see these tasks as having this kind of inherent value before they've actually had any real world impact. And I want to talk specifically about 2 reasons why I think this is a problem when it comes to design systems. So firstly, design system outputs are invariably the easiest thing for us to measure. But the trouble is that they don't have any inherent value. And secondly, even if we do manage to create value through meaningful outcomes, we also have to be able to show it. And that's because the most common reason that I see for design systems getting defunded is that stakeholders cannot see the value that they bring. So let's look at both of these now, starting with the first one. Design system outputs are easy to measure, but have no inherent value. Now, if you do a quick Google search on measuring the impact of design systems, you'll find a ton of articles and conference talks and webinars suggesting ways that you can do this. And I've actually included one of my own articles in the top left there, just to show that I'm not pointing fingers and I'm not biased here. But what you will notice as you start to go through these resources, including mine, is that we often define the success of our design systems by measures like which constituent parts we've created. So have we set up our Figma libraries or our component libraries? Have we built a documentation site? We think about how many components we've built. We think about what percentage of our product's UI needs we've covered with our design system. And we might look at things like how many teams are using it. But the trouble is that none of this actually matters in and of itself, right? These things are just artifacts and milestones on our journey. And we can work tirelessly to populate our design systems with all of the things that we think a good design system should entail. But the bottom line is that the most comprehensive design system in the world is still a failure unless it manages to create meaningful change. And so we really need to think about how we can assess this. And as well as that, we also need to think about how we communicate that. And that leads me on to my second reason for concentrating on outcomes rather than outputs, which is the need for us to have continuous investment. So stakeholders who don't understand the kind of evolutionary nature of design systems can assume that once we've shipped version 1, we're no longer needed. And I've seen this happen many times. Budget holders who don't understand the need for us to provide ongoing support and maintenance and to add to and update the system and to run processes like contribution are quick to assume that once we've shipped that version 1, they can reallocate our time to work that they consider to be more pressing. And even in organisations who have the most supportive leadership, it's not really enough to just say, trust us, this thing we've done is valuable. Eventually, somebody is going to say, prove it. And the really important thing here is that, remember that list of common success measures that I showed you a moment ago? Stakeholders don't care about them. Unless you are very close to the work, metrics like how many components you've built or how many teams are using them are kind of meaningless. What stakeholders care about is what that work results in. So what is the actual impact of us having done all of these things? And so to define that, there are 2 main questions that we need to ask ourselves. Number 1, who is benefiting from our system? And number 2, how are they benefiting? Now, when it comes to thinking about who we're helping, I like to use an adaptation of a framework that was originally developed by a service designer that I worked with in the UK government called Clara Griot. Now, this framework, or at least my version of it, sets out 4 different groups of people who are impacted by design systems. So first off, we have end users. Now, these are the people who use the products, usually websites and applications, that our design systems are used to create. Then we have our design systems primary users. So these are the people who use our design systems directly, so the tools, the documentation, and the processes to build those products. So usually these are going to be the designers and developers working in our organization's product and feature teams. Third, we have secondary users. That's confusing, isn't it? Third, we have secondary users. I trust you all to keep track of this. These are the people who benefit from our design systems, but they don't use them directly. So a good example of that would be maybe a product or delivery manager who probably won't interact with the design system in their day-to-day work, but will probably benefit from the additional efficiency that it affords their team. And then finally, we have stakeholders. So these could be the people who approve funding for our design system. And in practical terms, they might not be at all close to the work that we're doing, but we need to clearly communicate to them the return that they're getting on their investment. So I'm just going to walk us through a couple of examples of how we might define meaningful outcomes for some of these user groups and how we might go about measuring those. So let's start with end users. So just to remind you, these are the people using the products that our design systems get used to create. And the really interesting thing for me about this group when it comes to design systems is that we're not serving them directly. We're creating systems for designers and developers to use to build products that serve them. And because of that, it's easy to kind of assume that our work doesn't impact them or to overlook the ways that it impacts them. But the truth is that it really does, and often in these kind of weird and wonderful ways that we don't anticipate until it's too late. And if you'll indulge me in a quick shameless plug here, I actually made a podcast about this last year. So I wanted to explore ways in which design systems can perpetuate harm and how we can mitigate that. So the podcast is called Systems of Harm, and it's available on all good podcasting platforms. And throughout the series, I spoke to 6 amazing guests who all knew about design systems. They'd all kind of worked on them in some way, but who also all had personal experience of marginalisation and discrimination. And in episode 4 of the series, I spoke to a design systems manager and a friend of mine called Fred Warburton. Now, a few years ago, Fred was diagnosed at quite a young age with a degenerative eye condition called retinitis pigmentosa and was told that he was losing his sight. I worked with Fred at Babylon Health, and at that time, I watched him lead one of the most impressive and incredible pieces of organisation-wide accessibility advocacy work that I have ever seen. And what I learned from Fred during that time, and then when I spoke to him for the podcast, is that one outcome that a design system absolutely can influence for its end users is the accessibility of our products. So do they work for people with disabilities and people who are using assistive technology like voice control, screen readers, or screen magnifiers? And so to assess this, we can audit products or product areas that use the design system against the Web Content Accessibility Guidelines, or WCAG for short, and compare them with ones that don't. Now, at this point, some of you are probably feeling very smug at me saying this. I do want to issue an important disclaimer about measuring design systems' success with digital product accessibility, which is that it is actually very possible to build wildly inaccessible products using theoretically accessible components. Design systems are just one part of the picture, and a lot of the responsibility for ensuring product accessibility does indeed sit with the teams who are directly building those products. But I would like to add a counterpoint here, which is that I think our role in design systems in general, and specifically in terms of accessibility, needs to go beyond just providing components and tools. If we assume by default that part of our role as design system practitioners is to provide education and not just components, then I think that we absolutely can help to influence teams to build more accessible products. And so whilst we should recognise that our impact will always be diluted by other factors, I think there is value in assessing the outcomes of our efforts here. And so we should look at auditing our products against WCAG. And to that end, we can also carry out regular usability testing with disabled people and people who use assistive technology to find out whether we're moving things in the right direction over time. And as well as accessibility, we might consider how generally kind of intuitive and usable our products are. So the role of design systems is to promote usability and familiarity through establishing consistency. And so we can look at the impact of our design systems in this area fairly easily by auditing the number of component variations across products that use the design system and again comparing it with those that don't. And again, this is something we'd want to look at probably fairly regularly over time, just to check that we're reducing inconsistency as our system matures and as adoption increases. So these are just a couple of ways that we can assess our design system's impact on end users, but there's lots more to explore here, and I'm very happy to chat about this in more detail afterwards for those of you who are sticking around and want to talk about this. So I have 4 minutes left, so we're going to move on to look at the second group now that I'm going to give an example about, which is our impact on design systems primary users. So these are, just to remind you, the people who directly use our design systems to help them with their work. Now, one outcome we might consider meaningful here is whether designers can create prototypes more quickly when they're using the design system than without it. And one way to measure this is with usability testing. So when I was working at BT, we did this by asking designers to create a prototype based on a super low fidelity wireframe. And we compared the speed with which they did that before and after being given access to the design system. So we timed them in each case and we compared the results. And from this, we were able to see really quickly around a sort of 50% on average increase in the speed that they worked with the introduction of our design system. And I want to say usability tests like this are always slightly artificial, but they can be helpful for just assessing a general trend of kind of validating that the design system is having the intended impact. And they're also really useful for giving stakeholders numbers that they can attach costs to, which is important. And we also probably want to consider the developer experience. So are developers able to make updates in production more easily when they're using the design system than without it? And here again, we might conduct usability testing. We might give developers a prototype of a page to build and compare their speed and efficiency in completing the task when they have access to our design system than in a scenario without it. And if we wanted to collect real-life data, then we might consider comparing the frequency of product releases before and after the introduction of a design system. Again, I can't have enough caveats here. I think that design systems are, again, only one factor here and only one of the things that influence the team's speed. So if we're going to do this, we do have to be careful to take into account that other variables might be at play. But the last thing that I want to say about measuring outcomes is that data on the impact of design systems is always going to be imperfect. And I've seen teams spend months, sometimes even years, trying to get exact numbers. But the fact is that design systems are really complex and their impact is nearly always diluted by other practices and tools within an organisation. So my advice isn't just to give up, it's to just accept this and don't worry so much about getting precise numbers. Just concentrate instead on building up a general picture that shows you how your system is changing things over time. The most important thing is to keep your eye on the outcomes of your work. So think less about the features of your design system and the number of things that it contains, and more about the impact that it's having on the people that it touches. Lastly, make sure these outcomes make sense for your context. So the goals of every design system are going to be slightly different because the goals of every organisation are slightly different. So it's important to think about the kind of changes that you want to make and focus on working towards those. And this is where I want to finish up today with 38 seconds to spare. So I started this talk by saying design systems are like gardens. The climate and the conditions that we're working in are just as important as the parts of the system that we build. And our system's ability to work with the context that they exist in is ultimately what determines their survival. And so to create successful, lasting design systems, just to summarise, we have to design for our organisation's existing systems, so its practices, its culture and its people, not against them. We have to analyse the context that we're operating in and design our system around that, instead of just unquestioningly following industry conventions that may in fact not be right for us. And lastly, we have to measure the outcomes of our systems, not the outputs, to make sure that we're creating meaningful, lasting and sustainable change. Really hope this has been useful. If you want to chat about any of these points in more detail, then come and find me at the pub. Pixel Pioneers, you've been absolutely delightful. Thank you.